The horse remembered him long before the woman did. Rain slammed across the Wyoming plains hard enough to sting skin like thrown gravel, and the night sky looked split open by lightning. Elias Mercer pulled his coat tighter as his gelding fought against the wind beneath him. Somewhere out there, scattered across 15 miles of flooded grassland, half his cattle were disappearing into the storm. But the cattle stopped mattering the moment he heard the scream. It came sharp through the thunder. Human. Desperate. Elias turned instantly toward the sound, boots pressing into the stirrups as his horse pushed through mud nearly knee-deep. Another flash of lightning revealed the ravine ahead, swollen with black floodwater moving fast enough to tear fence posts from the earth. Then he saw it. A wagon tipped sideways near the edge of the creek, one wheel already hanging over open water. A white horse stood rearing beside it, reins tangled, eyes wild with panic. And beneath the shattered wagon door, pinned in the mud and rain, lay a young woman no older than 20. Elias didn't think. Men like him learned long ago that thinking too long got people killed by weather more often than bullets ever did. He jumped from the saddle and hit the water running. The creek was freezing cold, strong enough to shove against his legs with every step. The woman tried to pull herself free, but the wagon shifted dangerously each time she moved. "Don't fight it," Elias shouted over the storm. "You'll drag the whole thing down." Her frightened eyes locked onto him through strands of rain-soaked blonde hair. For a second, she looked less afraid of the flood than of trusting a stranger. Then thunder cracked overhead like cannon fire, and the earth beneath the wagon groaned. That made the choice for both of them. Elias wedged himself against the broken axle and forced the heavy wood upward with both shoulders. Mud sucked at his boots. Water sprayed across his face. The wagon moved barely 2 inches, but it was enough. "Now," he growled. The girl crawled free just as the rear wheel slipped over the edge and vanished into the raging creek below. Elias grabbed her arm and pulled her toward solid ground while rain hammered against his hat brim. Behind them, the white horse screamed again, still trapped in twisted leather straps near the waterline. Most men would have left it. The storm was growing worse by the second, and the girl was already shaking from cold and fear. But Elias noticed something strange. Even in panic, the horse kept looking at him, watching him, as if the animal already knew what kind of man stood in front of it. The young woman clutched his coat sleeve with trembling fingers. "Please," she whispered weakly, "don't let her drown." Elias looked toward the black water roaring through the ravine, then back at the terrified horse fighting against the current. Somewhere high above the canyon, lightning split the sky again, turning the entire flood silver for one brief second. And in that flash of light, Elias Mercer made the decision that would follow him for the rest of his life. Some storms leave scars on the land. Others leave them on people. Elias shoved through the freezing current toward the trapped horse, while the creek roared louder beneath the canyon walls. The white mare kicked wildly as broken leather straps pulled tighter around her front legs. One wrong movement, and the flood would drag her straight into the black water below. Behind him, the young woman struggled to stand on the muddy bank, soaked to the bone, one hand wrapped around her bruised shoulder. "Please," she called again, her voice shaking beneath the thunder. "Her name is Juniper." Elias did not answer. Wind tore across the ravine hard enough to nearly pull his hat away. He crouched beside the horse carefully, boots sliding against loose rock as icy water surged around his knees. Up close, he could see terror in the mare's pale eyes. Not anger, not aggression, fear, the kind animals carried when they knew nature was stronger than anything alive. "Easy now," Elias muttered quietly. "Easy, girl." Juniper jerked against the harness again, but the moment Elias touched her neck, something changed. The horse stilled. Not completely, just enough. Enough for him to work. Lightning flashed overhead, turning rain into silver needles across the canyon. Elias pulled a folding knife from inside his coat and began sawing through the soaked leather straps one by one. Each cut took too long. Each second made the current stronger. Somewhere upstream, another section of the flooded bank collapsed with a deep cracking sound that echoed through the darkness. The young woman heard it too. "Elias," she shouted suddenly. His head snapped up. It was the first time she had spoken his name. A wall of muddy water came rushing around the bend, carrying branches, broken fence rails, and pieces of somebody's barn. The flood had grown larger, meaner. Elias cut the final strap just as the wave slammed into the wagon remains, which shattered apart instantly. Juniper screamed and lost footing, her body sliding sideways toward the drop. Without thinking, Elias grabbed the horse's reins with both hands. The force nearly pulled him into the creek after her. Cold water crashed against his chest as his boots dug into the mud. For one terrible second, horse and man both hung at the edge together while the storm tried to take them. Then Juniper fought upward. Hard. Elias pulled with her until finally the mare stumbled onto solid ground, trembling violently beneath sheets of rain. Silence did not come afterward. Storms never gave silence that easily. But for a brief moment, the three of them stood there breathing hard beneath the lightning. The girl stepped closer slowly, wrapping shaking fingers around Juniper's neck. Tears mixed with rainwater on her pale cheeks. "Thank you," she whispered. Elias looked away toward the flooded plains beyond the ravine. He had heard gratitude before in his life. Most times it faded by morning. But Juniper kept staring at him. The mare moved closer until her wet nose brushed against his shoulder once. Gentle, deliberate, like she was memorizing his scent. Elias frowned slightly beneath the dripping brim of his hat. Horses remembered fear. They remembered pain. Sometimes they remembered cruelty. But very few remembered kindness. Somewhere far out across the dark prairie, another horse whinnied through the storm. Elias suddenly realized his own gelding had disappeared into the rain hours ago. The young woman noticed the change in his face immediately. "You lost your horse saving us," she said softly. Elias adjusted the soaked gloves on his hands and finally looked at her properly for the first time. She looked wealthy, even covered in mud. Fine stitching on her coat. Expensive gloves ruined by floodwater. But her eyes carried something lonelier than money could fix. "Storm takes what it wants," Elias said quietly. "Best thing a man can do is keep moving after." Then Juniper stepped between them unexpectedly and lowered her head against Elias's chest while thunder rolled low across the mountains like distant drums. By midnight, the storm had swallowed the road completely. Elias led Juniper through the rain while the young woman walked beside him wrapped in one of his old wool blankets. The nearest trading post sat nearly 4 miles east across open prairie, and every step through the soaked grass felt heavier than the last. Wind bent the tall plains grass flat beneath the storm, carrying the sharp scent of wet earth and distant pine from the mountains. Juniper stayed close to Elias the entire way. Too close. Horses usually calmed once danger passed. They drifted back toward their owners, toward familiarity. But every few minutes the white mare brushed against Elias's shoulder as if checking he was still there. The young woman noticed it too. "She does not trust many people," she said quietly through chattering teeth. "Neither do I," Elias answered. That almost made her smile. Almost. A flash of lightning revealed the outline of the trading post ahead at last. One stable. One lantern hanging crooked beside the porch. One tired-looking building leaning against the Wyoming wind like it had survived too many winters already. Elias pushed open the door, and warm firelight spilled across the rain behind him. Conversation inside stopped immediately. Half a dozen ranch hands looked up from their poker table near the stove while an older woman behind the counter narrowed her eyes toward the soaked strangers standing in the doorway. "Lord above," she muttered. "You look like the river spat you back out." Elias removed his hat slowly, rainwater dripping from the brim onto the wooden floorboards. "Need a dry room," he said, "and a place for the horse." The older woman glanced toward Juniper waiting outside in the storm. Even beneath mud and exhaustion, the mare looked expensive enough to buy the entire building twice over. "That horse yours?" she asked. "No," Elias replied simply. The young woman stepped forward then, still wrapped in the blanket. "My name is Clara Whitmore." The room changed after that. Not loudly, not dramatically, just enough. One of the ranch hands straightened in his chair. The older woman behind the counter suddenly looked nervous. The Whitmore name carried money across 3 territories. Railroad money, banking money, the kind of money that made sheriffs smile quicker and hotel doors open faster. Clara seemed too tired to notice the reaction around her. Her eyes stayed fixed on Juniper outside the window, where rain still poured across the porch roof in silver sheets. "Please make certain she is warm," Clara said softly. Elias did not wait for instructions. He disappeared back into the storm before anybody could answer. The stable smelled of hay, wet leather, and cold wood. Juniper lifted her head the moment Elias entered carrying fresh water and oats. He moved quietly around her stall, checking her legs for swelling beneath the lantern light. The mare watched every movement carefully. "You scared yourself good tonight," Elias muttered while tightening a dry blanket over her back. Juniper lowered her head slowly until her nose rested against his shoulder again. Elias paused. There it was again, that strange recognition in the animal's eyes. Like she understood more than she should. He had seen loyal horses before. Smart horses too. But this felt different somehow. Older. Deeper. Almost human. A soft voice came from behind him. "She only does that with people she trusts." Elias turned to find Clara standing in the stable doorway, firelight flickering behind her from the inn windows. Dry clothes now replaced the soaked dress she had worn during the storm, but exhaustion still lived across her face. She stepped closer carefully. "Juniper nearly died as a foal," Clara said quietly. Since then, she remembers fear very clearly. Elias rested a hand against the mare's neck. "Fear is easy to remember," he said. Clara shook her head gently. "No, not fear." Her eyes moved toward him then. Steady, thoughtful, kindness. Outside, thunder rolled lower now, drifting farther toward the mountains. But inside that stable, beneath lantern light and falling rain, Elias Mercer suddenly had the uneasy feeling that this storm was not ending at all. It was only beginning. Morning arrived gray and cold across the prairie, carrying that strange silence storms leave behind after they finish tearing through the world. Water dripped steadily from the roof of the trading post, while ranch hands stepped outside one by one to inspect the damage left by the night. Broken fence rails floated through muddy ditches. Half the road east had disappeared beneath floodwater. Somewhere far off, cattle cried across the plains looking for ground that had not turned to swamp. Elias Mercer sat alone near the stable wall sharpening an old horseshoe nail into a makeshift awl. He had barely slept. Men who spend enough years outdoors learned how to rest without truly closing their eyes. The stable doors creaked open behind him. Clara Whitmore stepped carefully into the pale morning light wrapped in a dark blue coat borrowed from the innkeeper. Her blonde hair remained damp at the edges from the storm, loose against her shoulders in the cold wind. Juniper noticed her instantly, but did not move away from Elias. That seemed to surprise Clara more than anything else. "She usually follows me everywhere," Clara said softly. Elias kept working the nail against a whetstone. "Maybe she is tired." Clara looked toward the mare and shook her head slightly. "No. Horses choose people for reasons they cannot explain." The words lingered there between them while the wind rattled loose tin somewhere behind the stable. Elias finally set the sharpened nail aside and stood slowly. Up close, Clara looked younger in daylight than she had during the storm, but exhaustion still shadowed her eyes. "Your family will send people looking for you," Elias said. "Already have." Clara nodded toward the road. Two black carriages sat near the trading post entranced around it, by well-dressed men checking wagon wheels and speaking in low, hurried voices. "My father owns rail lines from Cheyenne to Montana," she explained quietly. "When wealthy daughters disappear during storms, men start riding before sunrise." Elias gave a small nod like the information meant very little to him. In truth, railroad money belonged to another world entirely. Men like Elias lived by weather, cattle prices, and luck. Men like the Whitmores changed maps. Clara studied him carefully then. "You really do not know who I am, do you?" Elias slid the awl into his saddlebag. "Should I?" Something about that answer made Clara smile for the first time since the flood. Small, brief, real. But the moment ended when one of the suited men near the wagon spotted her. "Miss Whitmore," he shouted in relief. Three men hurried toward the stable immediately, boots splashing through mud. The oldest among them removed his hat quickly once he reached Clara. "Your father was beside himself," he said breathlessly. "We thought the creek took you." Clara glanced once toward Elias before answering. The creek almost did. The older man finally noticed the cowboy standing nearby in worn gloves and a weather-beaten coat. His eyes lingered on Elias only a second before reaching into his pocket. "Sir," he said stiffly, "Mr. Whitmore would generously reward anyone who assisted his daughter." He extended several folded bills forward. Elias looked at the money, then at Clara, then back toward Juniper standing quietly behind him. "Keep it," he said. The man blinked in confusion. This is more money than most ranch hands earn in 6 months. Then maybe your boss needs it more than I do. Clara watched him carefully after that. Not offended. Not angry. Almost curious. Like she had spent her whole life around men chasing Whitmore money, and suddenly found one walking away from it without hesitation. Elias grabbed his saddlebag and turned toward the stable exit. Juniper immediately stepped forward after him. One of the railroad men grabbed the mare's reins to stop her. Juniper jerked hard against the leather, ears pinning back sharply. Elias stopped walking. He did not touch the horse. Did not say a word. But the moment he looked toward Juniper, the mare calmed instantly. The stable went quiet. Even the wind outside seemed to disappear for one strange heartbeat. Clara stared at Elias with something unsettled in her expression now. Something deeper than gratitude. Wait, she said suddenly as he reached the doorway. Elias paused, but did not turn around. Clara stepped closer slowly. Will I ever see you again? Outside, cold morning sunlight finally pushed through the storm clouds, casting long gold across the muddy prairie. Elias rested one hand briefly against the stable doorframe. Storms pass, he said quietly. People do too. Then he walked out into the Wyoming morning, while behind him Juniper let out one low, restless cry that sounded almost human. 15 years passed the way winters pass across the prairie. Quiet at first, then all at once. Elias Mercer grew older beneath open skies and hard seasons. His dark hair turned silver near the temples. The deep Wyoming wind carved lines into his face like old riverbeds through stone. He lost cattle during drought years. Lost land during a brutal winter that froze half the territory solid for 6 straight weeks. Lost friends one by one to age, distance, and the simple habit of time forgetting people who lived too far from town. By the time he reached 50, Elias worked odd jobs wherever ranchers still needed an extra pair of hands. Repairing fences, breaking stubborn colts, sleeping in barns that smelled of dust and cold hay. Most folks in Bitter Creek barely noticed him anymore. The town had changed while he stayed the same. The railroad now cut straight through the valley where buffalo once moved like dark storms across the plains. Brick buildings replaced old wooden shops. Men wore polished boots now instead of trail dust. Even the saloon piano sounded cleaner somehow. But Elias still carried the same weathered saddlebag over one shoulder every place he went. And inside that saddlebag, wrapped carefully in cloth worn thin with years, rested a single broken horseshoe nail from the storm long ago. He never explained why he kept it. Maybe because some memories fade slower than others. That afternoon, dry wind rolled dust through Main Street while Elias repaired wagon wheels behind Miller's feed store for $2 a day and supper. The sun hung low and copper-colored above the mountains, throwing long shadows between buildings. A few boys raced past, kicking a flattened can through the dirt, while merchants shouted prices from wooden porches. Ordinary sounds. Ordinary day. Then the horses arrived. Every head on Main Street turned at once toward the far end of town, where a black carriage rolled slowly through the dust, pulled by 4 gleaming horses. Expensive horses. The kind rich families kept brushed cleaner than most men kept themselves. Behind the carriage rode 2 armed escorts wearing dark coats stitched with silver buttons. Somebody near the barber shop whistled softly. Whitmore people, one rancher muttered. Must be important business. Elias barely looked up at first. Wealthy travelers passed through Bitter Creek more often now that the railroad connected eastern cities to the frontier. Rich folks came west searching for scenery, adventure, or stories they could brag about back home. Usually they stayed one night and complained about the dust. But something changed the moment the carriage reached the center of town. The lead horse suddenly slowed. Then another. Then all 4 stopped completely. Drivers shouted commands. Leather reins snapped sharply in the dry air. But the horses would not move. People stepped off sidewalks to stare. One of the escorts rode forward angrily, trying to force the team onward. That was when the white mare appeared. Elias froze the instant he saw her. Older now, taller somehow, but unmistakable. Juniper stepped out from behind the black carriage and lifted her head high against the drifting dust. For one strange second the entire street went still. Then the mare turned directly toward Elias Mercer standing beside the wagon wheel. Not toward the driver. Not toward the wealthy passengers. Toward him. Elias slowly lowered the hammer from his hand. Juniper began walking forward through the middle of town without hesitation. Calm. Certain, like she had crossed 15 years only to find one person. Murmurs spread quietly through the crowd as the mare reached Elias and stopped inches away. Dust curled around their boots beneath the fading sunlight. Elias stared into the horse's pale eyes and saw it instantly. Recognition, deep and immediate. Juniper let out one low breath through her nose before gently pressing her head against his chest exactly the way she had during the storm long ago. The hammer slipped from Elias's fingers into the dirt. Nobody on Main Street spoke. Then slowly, beneath the stunned eyes of the entire town, the old white mare bent one front knee and lowered herself before him. Silence spread across Main Street heavier than church bells after a funeral. Elias Mercer stood motionless while the white mare remained kneeling before him in the dust. Nobody in Bitter Creek had ever seen anything like it. Horses bowed from fear sometimes. From injury too. But not like this. Not calm. Not willing. Juniper lowered her head slowly against Elias's worn coat, while the late afternoon wind carried dust around them in thin golden waves. One of the boys near the barber shop whispered first. That horse knows him. Then the murmuring started. Quiet at first. Curious. Suspicious. Men stepped down from porches. Women paused beside storefront windows. Even old Mr. Miller stopped stacking feed sacks behind the wagon shop to stare across the street. Elias barely noticed any of them. His eyes remained fixed on Juniper. The mare had grown older beautifully, white along the neck now with silver threading through her mane. Small scars marked her front legs from years on rough trails. But near her left eye, half hidden beneath drifting strands of hair, rested the same thin mark left by shattered wagon wood during the flood long ago. Elias reached out carefully and brushed his fingers near the scar. Juniper closed her eyes immediately, like she remembered that touch too. The black carriage door opened behind them with a soft creak. Boots touched the dirt slowly. Elias heard them before he looked up. Measured steps. Calm steps. Not the hurried footsteps of servants or guards. He turned gradually. Clara Whitmore stood beneath the fading sunlight dressed in a dark traveling coat trimmed with gray fur against the mountain cold. 15 years had changed her the same way they changed valleys and rivers. Gently at first, then completely. She no longer looked like the frightened girl trapped beneath storm wreckage. Confidence rested in the way she carried herself now. Quiet confidence. The kind built through years of surviving powerful rooms filled with powerful men. Yet the moment her eyes found Elias, something softer appeared beneath it all. Something older. Neither of them spoke immediately. Around them, Bitter Creek watched in complete silence. Clara stepped closer through the dust until she stood only a few feet away. I hoped she would remember, she said quietly. Elias swallowed once before answering. Most horses forget strangers by morning. Clara looked toward Juniper, still resting beside him. You were never a stranger to her. The words settled strangely in Elias's chest. 15 years. 15 long winters. Yet hearing Clara's voice again pulled the memory back sharp as lightning across black water. The flood. The rain. The moment Juniper nearly vanished into the creek. Elias glanced away briefly toward the mountains beyond town. You should not have come all this way over an old memory. Clara studied him carefully then. That is the strange thing about kindness, Elias. Her voice remained soft enough only nearby listeners could hear. The people who give it away rarely understand how long others carry it. One of the railroad escorts stepped forward uneasily behind her. Miss Whitmore, he interrupted carefully. The mayor is waiting at the hotel. Clara never looked away from Elias. He can wait longer. That caused another ripple through the crowd. Folks in Bitter Creek suddenly understood this was not some ordinary wealthy traveler passing through town. This woman held enough influence to make governors answer letters personally. Yet she stood in the middle of a dusty frontier street speaking to an aging ranch hand like he mattered more than schedules or meetings. Elias shifted uncomfortably beneath the attention. Men like him learned early that too many eyes usually brought trouble eventually. Juniper sensed the change immediately. The mare stepped closer again until her shoulder pressed lightly against Elias's arm. Protective. Familiar. Clara noticed that too. Then her expression changed slightly. Not sadness exactly. More like realization. You still carry it, do not you? She asked quietly. Elias frowned. Carry what? Clara's eyes lowered toward the worn saddlebag hanging beside him. The broken nail from her horseshoe. Elias felt the world go strangely still around him. He had never told a soul about that nail. Never showed it. Never spoke of it after leaving Wyoming all those years ago. Yet somehow Clara knew. Before Elias could answer, Juniper suddenly lifted her head sharply toward the northern road leading into town. The mare let out one low, uneasy breath through her nose. Not fear. Warning. And a second later, every person on Main Street heard it too. More horses were coming. The sound coming down the northern road did not belong to travelers. It belonged to men arriving with purpose. Hoofbeats rolled across Bitter Creek in slow rhythm beneath the fading evening light, while townspeople turned toward the dust cloud rising beyond the grain mill. Juniper's ears pinned back slightly beside Elias Mercer. Not panic. Awareness. The kind horses developed after surviving storms and long roads beside human trouble. Clara Whitmore glanced toward the road, and for the first time since arriving, concern crossed her face. "That is sooner than I expected," she murmured. Elias looked at her carefully. "Who is it?" Clara did not answer immediately. The riders appeared seconds later, 6 men wearing dark riding coats with silver badges pinned beneath their collars. Railroad security. Wealthy companies out west hired them often now that money moved faster than laws across the territories. The lead rider dismounted before the hotel porch and removed his gloves slowly. Tall man. Gray mustache. Eyes too sharp to miss much. He spotted Clara instantly and let out a long breath of relief. "Miss Whitmore," he said firmly while approaching through the crowd. "Your father sent telegrams across 3 states after hearing where you traveled." Clara straightened slightly. "I told him I wished to visit Bitter Creek privately." "With respect, ma'am," the man replied carefully. "Whitmore business does not travel privately anymore." That sentence changed the air around Main Street. Elias noticed it immediately. The guards were not here only because of Clara. Something larger followed behind them. Something heavy enough to put tension even into wealthy voices. Juniper shifted closer against Elias again. The old mare kept watching every movement around him. The gray-mustached guard finally noticed the horse kneeling beside the aging cowboy. Confusion flickered across his face. "What in God's name?" he muttered quietly. One of the younger guards laughed under his breath. "Looks like the animal adopted herself a ranch hand." A few townspeople chuckled nervously along with him. But Juniper did not move. She remained beside Elias like stone carved into the earth itself. Clara's expression hardened instantly. "That ranch hand," she said calmly, "once walked into a flooded canyon to save both my life and that horse while every sane man would have ridden away." Silence followed her words. Even the younger guard lowered his eyes slightly afterward. Elias shifted uncomfortably beneath the attention gathering around him. He had spent 15 years becoming invisible. Men like him survived easier that way. But now every eye in Bitter Creek seemed fixed on him again. Clara stepped closer. "There is something else you never knew," she said softly enough only Elias could hear. Elias frowned slightly. "What?" Clara glanced toward Juniper before answering. "The morning after the storm, when you rode away from the trading post, Juniper refused food for 2 days." Elias blinked once. Clara continued quietly. "She broke through a stable gate trying to follow your trail." Nearby conversations faded into background noise as Elias stared at the old mare beside him. Juniper lifted her head slightly at the sound of her name. Clara smiled sadly. "My father hired 3 men to track you down back then." Elias looked genuinely surprised now. "Why?" Clara held his gaze steadily. "Because I would not stop talking about the cowboy who walked back into floodwater for a horse nobody else would have saved." Wind swept dust softly between them, while lanterns along Main Street flickered alive one by one against the coming dusk. The gray-mustached guard approached again carefully this time. "Miss Whitmore," he said. "The mayor prepared supper at the hotel." Clara never looked away from Elias. "Then the mayor can set one more plate." Murmurs spread quietly through the watching crowd again. Men in Bitter Creek understood invitations from women like Clara Whitmore carried weight beyond politeness. Elias opened his mouth to refuse automatically. Years alone had made refusal feel safer than company. But before he could speak, Juniper nudged his shoulder firmly with her nose. Clara noticed that and smiled faintly. "Seems she already decided for you," she whispered. Elias looked down at the mare standing beside him beneath the growing evening shadows. Then slowly, for the first time in many years, the old cowboy laughed. The hotel dining room fell quieter than a church the moment Elias Mercer walked through the doors beside Clara Whitmore. Men who usually barely nodded at him near the feed store suddenly straightened in their chairs, pretending not to stare. Silverware slowed against plates. Whiskey glasses paused halfway to mouths. Even the piano player near the corner forgot the next note for a second. Elias noticed every bit of it immediately. Men who spent years drifting town to town learned how rooms changed when they entered them. Usually the change leaned colder. Suspicious. Tonight felt different somehow. Not warmer exactly. Just uncertain. Clara walked calmly beside him beneath the yellow glow of oil lamps, while Juniper remained tied outside, near the hitching rail, where she refused to let any stable hand touch her reins. The old mare kept her eyes fixed on the hotel windows the entire time. Elias removed his hat quietly as they entered the dining room. The mayor of Bitter Creek hurried forward instantly, smile stretched too wide beneath his gray mustache. "Miss Whitmore," he said breathlessly. "An honor. A true honor." Clara greeted him politely, but her attention drifted toward Elias instead. "Mr. Mercer will be dining with us." The mayor blinked once, before recovering. "Of course. Certainly." Elias almost smiled at that. Funny how quickly people learn manners once railroad money entered a room. They sat near the tall front windows overlooking Main Street, while waitresses carried out roast beef, potatoes, and fresh bread still steaming from the kitchen ovens. Elias stared at the food longer than he meant to. Real meals had become rare in recent years. Clara noticed immediately. Without a word, she slid the breadbasket slightly closer to him. Small gesture. Gentle. The kind rich people rarely remembered to make. Outside, twilight deepened across Bitter Creek while lanterns flickered alive one by one along the street. Through the glass, Elias could still see Juniper standing alert near the hitching rail. Watching. Always watching. Clara followed his gaze. "She still waits for storms," she said quietly. Elias frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" Clara folded her hands carefully atop the tablecloth. After that night, every time thunder rolled across the valley, Juniper would stand facing the road for hours. Elias looked back toward the horse outside. Something tightened slowly in his chest. Clara continued softly. "At first my father believed she was frightened after the flood." Her eyes lifted toward Elias again. Then one night, during another storm, she broke free from the stable and walked nearly 6 miles toward the old canyon road. Elias swallowed once. "Why?" Clara smiled sadly. "Because that is the direction you rode when you left." The sounds inside the dining room faded strangely around him after that. Plates clinking, chairs scraping, conversations drifting through cigar smoke. All of it felt distant suddenly. Clara reached carefully into the small leather bag resting beside her chair. When her hand emerged again, she held something wrapped in faded cloth. Elias recognized the cloth immediately before she even unfolded it. Old blue stitching, water-stained edges. His breathing slowed. Clara opened the cloth carefully atop the table between them. A broken piece of horseshoe rested inside, rusted now with age, bent near one edge from years ago. Elias stared silently at it while the room around them disappeared completely. "You kept it," he said quietly. Clara nodded once. "Juniper lost it during the flood." Elias looked genuinely confused. "I thought I carried the only piece left." Clara's expression softened. "You did not know?" She touched the rusted metal gently with one finger. The morning after the storm, stable hands found the rest of the horseshoe buried in mud near the ravine. Elias looked back toward her slowly. Clara's voice dropped lower then. "I returned to that canyon every year after." The old cowboy blinked once in surprise. "Every year." Clara nodded toward Juniper outside the window. She always stopped at the exact same place beside the creek. Wind rattled softly against the hotel glass while dusk settled deeper over Bitter Creek. Then Clara said the one thing Elias Mercer had never expected to hear in his life. "You think you disappeared after saving us," she whispered. "But the truth is, neither of us ever stopped looking for you." Some men spend their whole lives believing they left no mark behind them. Elias Mercer carried that belief for 15 years like an old saddle worn smooth by weather and silence. So hearing Clara Whitmore say she had searched for him all those years left him staring at the rusted horseshoe piece on the table as if it belonged to somebody else entirely. Outside the hotel windows, Bitter Creek settled deeper into evening. Wind pushed dust softly along Main Street, while lanterns glowed warm against dark storefront glass. Juniper still stood near the hitching rail beneath the lamps, calm now, but alert in the way old horses became after surviving enough hard seasons beside human beings. Clara folded the faded cloth back around the broken horseshoe carefully. My father called it foolishness, she admitted quietly. He said storms create strange emotions people mistake for meaning. Elias looked toward her slowly. And what did you say? Clara smiled faintly. I told him no frightened girl remembers a stranger's face for 15 years unless something important happened that night. The old cowboy lowered his eyes toward the untouched coffee beside him. Steam no longer rose from the cup. You were young, he muttered. People remember things differently when they are scared. Clara shook her head immediately. No, her voice stayed calm, but certain. I remember exactly what happened. Elias remained silent after that. Because deep down, part of him feared she might remember too much. Not the flood itself. Not the storm. The other thing. The part nobody knew. Clara leaned slightly closer across the table. You never told anyone you went back a second time, did you? Elias's jaw tightened almost invisibly. There was nothing to tell. That is not true. Her eyes held his steadily now. You carried me to safety first. I remember that clearly. But after you laid me near the rocks, you turned around and walked back into the flood alone. Elias glanced toward the window again, toward Juniper. Clara followed his gaze. The harness rope had wrapped around her front legs. She could not move. She paused softly. You could have left. Elias finally answered, though quietly. Most men would have. Clara nodded once. Yes. The dining room around them continued buzzing softly with low conversations and clinking silverware, but none of it reached Elias anymore. The memory returned sharper now than it had in years. Black water crashing through the ravine. Juniper slipping toward the drop. The sound the horse made when fear turned almost human. Clara's voice interrupted the memory gently. Do you know what Juniper did after you disappeared? Elias shook his head once. Clara smiled sadly toward the horse outside. Every storm after that, she waited. The old cowboy swallowed slowly. Clara continued. Some nights, she stood facing the road until morning. Stable hands thought she had gone strange. Wind rattled softly against the hotel windows again. But I knew better, Clara whispered. She was waiting for the man who came back for her. Elias looked down at his rough hands resting near the cold coffee cup. Those hands looked older than he remembered suddenly. Scarred. Weathered. Empty. Funny thing about loneliness. After enough years, a man stopped expecting anybody to remember the good parts of him. Clara reached carefully into her coat pocket, then, and placed something small. Beside the wrapped horseshoe cloth, a folded yellow telegram. Elias frowned slightly. What is that? Clara hesitated before answering. 3 months ago, my father passed away. Elias lifted his eyes toward her immediately. Real sadness rested there now beneath her calm expression. I am sorry, he said quietly. Clara nodded gratefully. Before he died, he told me something strange. She unfolded the telegram carefully. He admitted he kept the records from the search teams he hired after the flood. Elias blinked once. Records? Clara slid the paper toward him slowly. One of the men nearly found you. Elias stared at her. Clara's voice lowered almost to a whisper. But somebody paid that man to stay silent instead. The old cowboy frowned deeply now. Who? Clara held his gaze across the dim hotel light, while outside Juniper suddenly lifted her head sharply toward the dark end of Main Street again. Then Clara answered softly. Your older brother. The words hit Elias Mercer harder than the storm ever had. Your older brother. For a long moment, he simply stared across the table at Clara Whitmore, while the hotel dining room faded into distant noise around him. 15 years of drifting from ranch to ranch suddenly shifted inside his memory like loose boards under heavy boots. Elias had not spoken his brother's name aloud in nearly a decade. Nathan Mercer. Older by 6 years. Sharper with money. Better with people. The kind of man towns trusted quickly because he always smiled before asking for something. Elias leaned back slowly in his chair, weathered fingers tightening once around the edge of the table. That does not make sense, he muttered quietly. Clara slid the folded telegram closer. The search records listed a ranch outside Casper where you had worked after the flood. Elias frowned. I remember that ranch. Clara nodded. One of the hired men tracked you there 2 months later. She paused carefully. But according to his statement, your brother arrived before he could speak to you. Wind moved softly against the hotel windows while lantern light flickered across the table between them. Elias lowered his eyes toward the telegram. Nathan told him to. Stay away. Clara shook her head once. He paid him. The old cowboy let out a slow breath through his nose. Not anger. Not disbelief. Something sadder than both. Because deep down, Elias understood immediately why Nathan might have done it. Their father died owing debts across 3 counties. Their small family ranch had barely survived those years. Then Elias disappeared after the flood, leaving Nathan alone to carry everything. Responsibilities. Payments. Burdens. My brother always believed men should bury the past if they wanted peace, Elias said quietly. Clara studied him carefully. And do you believe that? Elias looked out the window toward Juniper standing beneath the hotel lantern glow. The mare still faced the building like a patient guardian waiting through another long night. No, he admitted after a moment. But some people get tired carrying memories nobody else sees. Clara's expression softened. You carried them anyway. Elias almost smiled at that, though tiredness sat heavy behind his eyes now. One of the railroad guards approached carefully then, lowering his voice near Clara's shoulder. Miss Whitmore, there is another matter. She looked up immediately. What is it? The guard glanced uneasily toward Elias before answering. A man arrived asking questions about Mr. Mercer. Elias stiffened slightly. Clara noticed at once. Who? She asked firmly. Claims his name is Nathan Mercer. Silence settled over the table. Outside, Juniper suddenly lifted her head higher toward the dark end of Main Street, where another horse stood waiting near the saloon hitching rail. Elias did not turn immediately. He already knew the shape memory made before seeing it. Clara watched him carefully. You did not know he was in Bitter Creek. Elias shook his head slowly. Not until now. Through the hotel windows, the outline of a tall man became visible beneath the street lanterns. Broad shoulders. Gray coat dusted from travel. Hat brim pulled low. Even after all these years, Elias recognized his brother's posture instantly. Nathan stood still beside his horse, staring toward the hotel entrance like a man debating whether to walk inside or ride away forever. Clara lowered her voice gently. Do you want me to send him away? Elias remained silent for several long seconds. Old memories moved behind his eyes now. 2 boys repairing fences under Wyoming sunsets. Winter mornings breaking ice from cattle troughs. Their mother singing softly near the stove before sickness carried her off too early. Strange how time could turn whole lifetimes into shadows inside a man's chest. Finally, Elias stood slowly from the table. His knees ached more than they used to. Another reminder of how many years had passed between storms. No, he said quietly. If a man rides this far carrying old ghosts, he deserves the chance to speak. Clara rose with him instinctively. You do not have to face him alone. Elias looked toward her then, surprised by the sincerity in her voice. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Outside, the wind rolled colder down Main Street, while Juniper remained standing perfectly still beneath the lantern light between the 2 brothers waiting at opposite ends of 15 silent years. The night air outside the hotel carried the smell of dust, horses, and distant pine drifting down from the mountains. Elias Mercer stepped onto the wooden porch slowly while lantern light stretched long shadows across Main Street behind him. Clara Whitmore followed a few steps back, her coat pulled tightly against the cold Wyoming wind. Across the street, Nathan Mercer still stood beside his horse beneath the flickering glow of a saloon lantern. He looked older than Elias remembered, broader through the shoulders, gray in the beard now. Time had touched them both with the same rough hands. For a long moment, neither brother moved. 15 years sat between them heavier than words. Then Nathan finally crossed the street, boots slow against the dirt, hat lowered slightly against the wind. Juniper watched him carefully from the hitching rail, but remained calm beside Elias. Nathan stopped 3 feet away, close enough to see the lines weather had carved into his younger brother's face, close enough to realize just how many years had truly passed. You look terrible, Nathan said quietly. Elias let out one tired breath that almost sounded like a laugh. Good to see you too. Something loosened slightly in Nathan's expression after that. Not happiness exactly. Relief maybe. The kind men felt when old ghosts finally answered back. Clara stayed silent near the hotel porch, while townspeople watched discreetly from windows and boardwalks pretending not to stare. Nathan removed his gloves slowly. I did not know if you would even speak to me. Elias folded his arms against the cold. Depends what you came to say. Wind rolled dust softly between their boots. Nathan lowered his eyes briefly before answering. The truth. Silence followed. Juniper shifted once beside the hitching rail, her pale coat glowing beneath lantern light. Nathan glanced toward the horse. That mare still remembers you, he muttered quietly. Elias did not answer. Nathan nodded slowly like a man confirming something painful to himself. Then maybe you deserve the truth after all. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out an old folded paper worn soft from years of carrying. The man Clara hired found me first before he reached you. Elias stared at the paper. I figured that much. Nathan looked ashamed now. Truly ashamed. He said a wealthy railroad family wanted to reward the cowboy who saved their daughter. He paused carefully. At the time, our ranch was already dying. Taxes overdue. Feed gone. Half the cattle dead after winter. Elias remained silent. He remembered those years too well. Nathan swallowed once before continuing. I thought if rich people found you, you would leave Wyoming forever. The words hung there quietly beneath the lantern light. Clara's expression softened behind them as realization settled deeper across the street. Nathan looked toward his younger brother again. Selfish men make selfish choices when they are scared. Elias stared at him for several long seconds, then finally asked the question that mattered most. Why now? Nathan's eyes lowered toward the dirt road between them. Because 3 months ago the doctor told me my heart is failing. The wind seemed to stop for one strange heartbeat. Elias frowned deeply. Nathan gave a faint, tired smile. Funny thing about dying, Eli. He had not called him that since they were boys. A man suddenly remembers every decent thing he buried to survive. Elias looked away toward the dark mountains beyond town. Memories moved there too now. Long rides beside his brother through open prairie. Learning to rope cattle together before either of them needed shaving. Their father teaching them how to read storms by cloud color alone. Nathan stepped closer carefully. I stole 15 years from you, he admitted softly. Not because I hated you. Because I was afraid of losing the only family I had left. Elias's jaw tightened once beneath the lantern glow. Then Juniper moved unexpectedly. The old mare stepped forward between the brothers and lowered her head gently against Nathan's shoulder first, then against Elias's chest. Back and forth. Slow. Patient. Like some silent creature wiser than both men, was tired of watching humans carry pain too long. Nathan let out one broken laugh under his breath while rubbing tired eyes with one hand. Even the horse thinks we are fools, he muttered. And for the first time in 15 years, Elias Mercer stepped forward and embraced his older brother beneath the cold Wyoming night, while the town of Bitter Creek watched in complete silence. By sunrise, the whole town of Bitter Creek knew the story. Frontier towns always moved information faster than trains whenever emotion carried it. Men drinking coffee outside the barber shop spoke quietly about the old cowboy who had once walked back into floodwater for a horse. Women sweeping dust from wooden porches whispered about the wealthy railroad woman who searched 15 years for the ranch hand nobody else remembered. And somewhere between those stories, people began looking at Elias Mercer differently. The morning came cold and pale across the valley. Thin frost clung to wagon wheels and fence rails, while smoke rose lazy from chimneys into the bright Wyoming sky. Elias stood outside the small stable behind the hotel, brushing Juniper slowly beneath the early sunlight. The old mare leaned gently into every stroke of the brush, eyes half closed in peaceful contentment. Horses aged honestly. They never pretended to be stronger than they were. Juniper's joints moved slower now. White hairs covered her muzzle completely. But standing there beside her, Elias realized something strange. She looked old without looking broken. Nathan Mercer emerged from the hotel a few minutes later, carrying 2 tin coffee cups. He walked slower than the night before. More careful. Elias noticed that too. Nathan handed him 1 cup silently before resting against the stable fence nearby. For a while neither brother spoke. Morning wind rustled softly through the cottonwood trees beyond town, while Juniper chewed hay behind them. Finally Nathan broke the silence. Doctor says I should not be riding much farther west after winter. Elias stared into the steam rising from his coffee. Heart trouble. Nathan nodded once. Comes from years of worrying over things men cannot fix. Elias almost smiled at that. That covers most things worth worrying about. Nathan laughed quietly beneath his breath. The sound carried sadness inside it now. I spent 15 years thinking I protected this family by keeping you hidden from the Whitmores. He glanced toward the stable. Truth is, all I did was make everybody lonelier. Elias looked toward Juniper, brushing her nose against the stall door. Maybe loneliness was already coming for all of us anyway. Nathan shook his head slowly. No, some loneliness gets chosen. Those words stayed with Elias long after the conversation ended. Around noon, Clara Whitmore arrived near the stable, dressed for travel. Elegant dark riding coat, gloves stitched from fine leather. Yet none of it made her seem distant standing there beside the old wooden fence. She looked toward Nathan politely before her eyes settled on Elias. I have a proposal, she said calmly. Elias sighed softly. Rich people always do. That earned the smallest smile from her. Clara reached into her satchel and unfolded several documents against the fence rail. The Whitmore Company recently purchased 200 acres north of Bitter Creek. Nathan raised an eyebrow immediately. Even Elias frowned slightly. Land near the valley had become expensive since the railroad arrived. Clara looked directly at Elias while speaking. There is an abandoned ranch house there. Good water. Strong pasture. Stable already built. Elias understood instantly where the conversation was headed and shook his head before she finished. No, Clara did not react. You have not heard the offer yet. Do not need to. Elias set down the coffee cup carefully. I spent too many years surviving alone to become somebody's charity project now. Clara stepped closer slowly. It is not charity. Wind moved softly through the stable behind them while Juniper watched the conversation quietly. Clara lowered her voice. The ranch legally belongs to Juniper. Elias blinked once in confusion. Nathan stared openly now. Clara held up one signed paper. My father transferred the deed into her name years ago as a joke after she refused every stable but the one near the old canyon. She smiled faintly. But before he died, he added one condition. Elias frowned. What condition? Clara's eyes softened. The ranch passes to the only man Juniper willingly kneels beside. Silence settled around the stable. Even the wind seemed to pause. Elias looked toward the old white mare standing peacefully behind the fence while sunlight glowed across her silver mane. Juniper lifted her head slowly, then walked forward until she stood directly beside him once more. And before anyone spoke another word, the old horse bent one knee gently into the Wyoming dirt. The first snow came early that year. Thin white frost rolled across the Wyoming valley like quiet smoke, while the new ranch north of Bitter Creek settled into winter beneath wide gray skies. Elias Mercer spent his mornings repairing fences and his evenings beside the fire with coffee warming slowly in his hands. For the first time in many years, he no longer woke wondering where he would sleep once the weather turned colder. The ranch was not large by railroad standards. One stable, one weathered barn, a small house overlooking open pasture where the wind carried the smell of pine down from the mountains. But to Elias, it felt richer than anything he had owned before because peace lived there. Real peace. Nathan stayed through most of the winter too. His health worsened as the months passed, but something softer had returned to him after the years of silence finally broke between the brothers. Some nights the two men sat on the porch together beneath blankets listening to coyotes howl beyond the hills, while Juniper rested nearby in the snow-covered pasture. Clara visited often from the railroad office in Cheyenne. Sometimes she arrived with paperwork and business concerns. Other times, she came only to ride beside Elias across the frozen valley trails without saying much at all. Those became his favorite visits. Because out west, people who understood silence were rarer than gold. Juniper grew weaker after the first hard freeze. Age finally began settling heavily into her bones. Elias noticed it in the small things first. The slower steps toward the water trough. The careful way she lowered herself near the stable at night. The longer pauses between breaths after riding even short distances. One evening near Christmas, snow drifted softly across the ranch while Elias brushed frost from Juniper's silver mane beneath lantern light. The old mare leaned gently against his shoulder the way she had during the storm all those years ago. Clara